A warm welcome to everyone that's with us this evening. This is the last discussion of this conversation series that's powered by the collaboration between the Geneva Challenge and the Right Livelihood Foundation. So first of all, thank you to the participants of the Geneva Challenge for showing enthusiasm and participating in this contest, despite the challenges of the pandemic, which many of you, all of us, have faced. We are thrilled to announce that we have 269 confirmed teams with 1,094 participants from all across the world who will be working on ideas to solve real-world problems. So for those who don't know, a quick introduction. The Geneva Challenge is hosted by the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva. It's a project funded by Swiss Ambassador Jeno Stalen and aims to encourage interdisciplinary problem-solving analysis among master students on advancing human development goals within the scope of a relevant topic that changes from year to year. This year, students are invited to develop analysis-based proposals on the challenges of crisis management. The Right Livelihood Award by the Foundation was established to honor and support courageous laureates across the world solving global problems. The Right Livelihood Award honors the laureates who, through their work, promote scientific research, education, public understanding, and practical activities which contribute to a global ecological balance, are aimed at eliminating material and spiritual poverty, and contribute to lasting peace and justice in the world. The aim of this collaboration is to provide an exclusive opportunity to the participants of the Geneva Challenge to interact with Right Livelihood Laureates and encourage in a discussion about the challenges and opportunities they may have faced while working for different causes. The diverse voices and journeys of the laureates seek to inspire, motivate, and offer perspectives to the participants. We regret that, of course, like most other things during this pandemic period, we are doing this exclusively online, but we do want the session to be interactive, and we invite the participants who we cannot see online to put your questions and comments in the Q&A box, please, which is present on the right side of your screen. That'll allow you to interact with the speaker and myself, the moderator. This event will be recorded and will also be made available on the Facebook page of the Geneva Challenge. So with that, I would like to take this opportunity to present our speaker for this evening, Mr. Colin Gonsalves. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award in 2017. So Laureate Gonsalves is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. He's the founder of the Human Rights Law Network, which is an Indian national network of public interest lawyers. A significant part of his work in the legal arena has focused on using public interest litigation to fight for the rights of citizens across a diverse range of issues. For example, this has included the landmark Right to Food case from 2001, which resulted in free midday meals to school children across the nation, something of enormous importance for a country such as India, where more than a fifth of people live in extreme poverty, much under $2 a day. This has also included securing landmark judgments from the Supreme Court of India against immunity from criminal prosecution of Indian armed forces, for example, which for decades had allowed extrajudicial executions in the northeastern region of India. In addition, he has engaged and continues to engage in extensive advocacy in the area of human rights, economic welfare, and political rights, and continues to work in multiple ways to advance the human rights of India's most economically vulnerable and socially marginalized groups. We are very privileged to have him here with us today and share some of his perspectives on working with human rights challenges in particular. So having said this, I would like to turn things over to Mr. Gonsalves, or to Colin, and to give him the floor to start speaking and make his presentation for the evening. So over to you. You're on mute, I think.
Good morning, everybody. I speak to you from India where the time is 9:30 at night. A very good time to do a lot of hard work in India. And I'm happy to be with you today and to talk to you about the challenges of crisis management. The topic itself allows for a certain degree of latitude with what is to be spoken. And so I've stretched the limits of this topic to its maximum limit today. I thought initially I would talk to you about some of the human rights cases taking place in India, the right to food case, which brought food to something like 700 million people, the largest class action case in the world. I thought I would speak to you about prisoners in jail during the period of COVID, where you have overcrowding to the extent of 200% in jails. And the Supreme Court recently released 60,000 persons from jails because of the fear of the spread of COVID in jails. But when I thought of all that, I decided against it. And I want to speak to you today of a larger issue, a larger picture, a bigger canvas, and a bigger task for all of us to undertake. And I changed my mind because I was told that many of the persons participating today are young people. Many of them are from the global south. And I want to talk to you about changing the world radically. I want to talk to you about not settling for tiny changes. The crises that we face in the world cannot be solved by administratively doing things a little better here and there, tinkering a little here and there, although there are many who will tell you that that is exactly what is needed to handle the crisis. It's a political issue. It's a political crisis of unimaginable proportions, and it requires a very hard-hitting, no compromise action, a global action right across the world. The world is falling apart. And I'm not talking of climate change, which by itself indicates that the world is falling apart, and it may be. Although we would love to reverse what's happening, it might possibly be that the tipping point is past and the world is going to just finish off, not because of anything else, but because we as human beings, and capitalists particularly, are so greedy and so exploitative that it might be that it is impossible now to change the world. I think perhaps we are at a position where we can still change the world, but only time will tell. The capitalist system is falling apart, and I think young people must use this phrase more and more often. Because I know there is a terrible dread of socialism, because socialism was equated with China and Russia. But China and Russia are countries very far away from socialism, quite despotic in many ways. But I think we must get used to the idea of calling a spade, which is that the capitalist system and the way in which labor and capital are organized, and the way in which greed prevails and the exploitation of people and the exploitation of the earth happens, this system can no longer satisfy the urges and aspirations of the young. I do believe that the young want a different world. I do believe that the young are not tolerant of the kind of rubbish that has taken place in the world, the kind of rubbish that politicians have spoken to us about, universally, globally, right across the world. And this rubbish and these stories and these excuses have now to go. And I don't believe the young want to listen to this kind of rubbish anymore. You can see the signs everywhere. Earlier, it used to be just in the global south where we saw hunger and wars, illiteracy, ill health, and so on, unemployment. But now it's come to the heart of Europe. And as I watched the developments in Europe and in India and in the global south over the last decades, I began to feel that perhaps there's a great globalization of injustice. There's a great globalization of all the things, all these symptoms of ill health in the world system. You can see unemployment rise in Europe. My friends from Italy tell me about how many young people are moving back with their families because they can't afford to stay separately. And unemployment is at frightening levels. You can see wars and violence everywhere. It's not just the war in Syria, which has caused so much suffering. And we've all seen the bombing of Gaza. And the same old story and the same old excuses and the same old statements made at the UN. And you know things are not going to change. The Palestinians are going to be hammered and hammered and hammered. And they're never going to give up. But the hammering is not going to stop. We have seen unimaginable migration on a scale that the world has not seen for a very long time. And refugees spreading everywhere. A great universalization of poverty, hunger, illiteracy, desperation, and homelessness, and statelessness. And we see hunger, ill health, and illiteracy spread across the boundaries of the global south to developed countries where people thought hunger was impossible to see. Illiteracy was impossible in the developed world. And ill health, not here, maybe Africa, but not here. Maybe India, but not. And I come from a country which has a 7% GDP, which prides itself as a world economic power, but hides from the world that we have 700 million Indians below the poverty line of $4 a day. Unimaginable hunger. And to describe it to you in picturesque terms, it would be a typical village in Uttar Pradesh, a state in India, where a child gets up in the morning and sees his father, her father, sitting on his haunches, and she knows that he's got no work today. So she goes over to the well and draws water and drinks water because she knows, God knows for how many days, that she will have to fill her stomach with water. There is no food to eat. And to us in the developed world who would come home and open a fridge and have a beer and have a sandwich and have a snack and so on, the imagery of hunger in my country haunts me, where you can go into hut after hut in a village in India. Go inside and you would find not a single edible item in the house. Not a grain of sugar, not a grain of rice. And yet you will see people with the biggest hearts and the warmest personalities sending their children out to buy a little bit of milk to put in the tea to feed the guest who has come there. And then on top of that, you have COVID. And in India, we have had 300,000 people die. And the deaths in the global south, at least, but I think it's also true of America, is not due to the virus. It's due to the fact that under globalization, and I define globalization in very simple terms, 3 words: subsidies are bad. It's not the job of the state to look after the poor. In a globalized economy, let businesses thrive. Let industrialists set up factories and commercial establishments. They will make money. Some of that money will trickle down, and you'll get jobs, and you'll get the ability to pay for your education, for housing, for healthcare, food. What an imaginary world. If the state says we won't look after you, because in a globalized world, we're not supposed to look after anyone. Market will provide. What a theory of illusion. This change is coming to you. This change has come to you. You will not be able to live like your parents lived. You're in your 20s and 30s today, and you think perhaps my parents lived a nice life in capitalism. The world was in order. We got jobs, we got married, we bought a house, we bought a car, we got our pensions after that. But the change in the world is rapidly coming to your doorstep. And everything your parents took for granted, and you possibly take for granted because you think your parents' path in the world will be reproduced by you. But that is not going to happen. The world is in fundamental strife. It is self-destructing. And the crisis between the rich and the poor is so severe that short of people mobilizing and organizing to make the world a better place, it is not going to happen. You've seen the Arab Spring. You've seen the agitation in Hong Kong. The young with their rough tactics, non-violent, direct action, are showing us a way forward. Namely, that we can't rely on the authorities and politicians and lawmakers and parliamentarians to lead us to freedom. We have to take the law into our own hands. Now, that's a dangerous phrase. But I don't mean take the law into your own hands to break the law. What I mean is you have to take the law into your own hands to implement the law. For you cannot expect people in power, capitalists, industrialists, and others, to implement the law equally for all. I live in a very difficult country. And so when I speak with anger the way I speak today, when I speak with bitterness, when I speak with frustration, when I speak with intolerance sometimes, although I do believe in nonviolence very, very deeply, I speak that way because I know in the global south as well as in the developed world, the police are taking away the fundamental rights of citizens. Political parties, left, right, or center, are taking away our rights. And we have no one to rely on. We have nowhere to turn to. And I want to use the words of the framer of our constitution in India, Dr. Ambedkar, that you have to organize, you have to educate, you have to agitate, and you have to mobilize to break the chains of servitude. Thank you, my friends. And I do hope we have ample time now for question and answers when the time comes.
Thank you so much. That was a rousing call to action. I have a few questions, but I mean, I'd like to address some of the points that you've raised in what you've just said. So you spoke about the challenges of globalization, or more specifically, free trade, the idea of globalization entirely sort of encapsulated in free trade. But I wonder if we can also speak about the opportunities for sort of building solidarity transnational networks, and so on, using this sort of globalization culture that we live in today, where it gives us an opportunity to maybe work on global problems, but also problems that may be local problems, but things that we are, as a sort of a moral, sort of global population, perhaps all can be invested in. What do you think, if we were to actually act instead of simply sort of talking and coming together in abstract terms, can you think of, or can you talk about specific opportunities that globalization presents, or particular spaces in the global arena, or particular organizations, or so on, which can either be opportunities for us, or maybe spaces where we should focus our, let's say, dissent and opposition, or particular issues that can bring us together that globalization presents an opportunity around? How do we use globalization to our benefit?
See, that part is not very difficult. The movements, the social movements have always understood that globalization opens up the world for them to organize, agitate, collaborate, build friendships, build partnerships, build movements right across the world. That's not a difficult part. It's not contentious at all. We have never been against people who speak against globalization and not against technology. They're not against travel. They're not against, spreading the ideas and books and poetry and, everything else. But it's very important to use globalization in the very dark and sinister way in which it actually operates. And we should not use the language of globalization which the World Bank has taught us to use. So we should not accommodate globalization with human rights, because globalization, the World Bank variety, the capitalist variety, is globalization of hunger, globalization of poverty, globalization of terror, globalization of the stranglehold of the rich over the poor. Therefore, globalization, at least in the global south, and I think it's true everywhere in the developed world as well, globalization is a real bad word. It's actually the word of the human rights activist. It should have been our word, because we speak of globalization of human rights. But those who torment the world and torment the poor have captured that word, that magical word which should have been part of our vocabulary, globalization. And so I hesitate, I shudder to say that there's a good side to globalization. I don't believe there is. Globalization, if you look at it at a large level, in terms of the overarching massive impact of negative policies for the poor right across the world. And you can look at anything. You can look at the WHO and health policy, and you can see the effect of globalization. You can see the agreement on agriculture and see its effect on, farmers in the developing world. So I don't agree that globalization has any positive, this kind of globalization. And maybe we just need to have our own language, an alternative language for globalizing human rights and not globalizing poverty and discrimination.
So one of the things that sort of I have mulled over when thinking about not globalization per se, but the global arena and global solidarity in some sense, is this current version of globalization is very much focused on power and norms around the global north, as it were. So maybe Northern America, European, the more powerful European economies, the Western European economies. But there doesn't seem to be a counterpart growth in solidarity, or I don't know, treaties or agreements or coming together of countries in the global south. So south-south conversations, dialogues, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe your interactions with other, let's say, activists, advocates across the global South, and how we can speak to that connection more.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, the globalization of the global North no longer exists. It's the globalization of the world.
Mm.
And the globalization of the North is as prominent and perhaps more vicious in the global South.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at what globalization our Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, brought in here, it was as devastating and as cruel and terrorist as any globalization in any part of the world. So there's no real distinction now between the North and the South in terms of the policies and practices of globalization. Secondly, I don't really like this theory of South-South. And I say this because the working people in the South and the working people in the North have the same interests, totally the same interests. The working people of the North and South are one. The poor are one. And the division of South and North is an artificial division in NGO talk. So, as if the South will now mobilize against the North, not like that at all. The poor will mobilize against the rich. And the poor will mobilize against the rich, not recognizing any barrier between the South and the North, and being truly global in the mobilization of the working people against capitalism.
Can you sort of give us some examples of maybe in your work where you may have worked with, I would say, maybe community-based or member-based or activist organizations from other countries who are working in the international arena with, sort of the poor and underprivileged across countries? What has been your experience there?
Look, I'm a lawyer. I practice in the Supreme Court. And we have marvelous networks of lawyers right across the globe. Extensive networks in the global South. Not such extensive networks with the lawyers and the legal fraternity in Europe and America and Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere and Canada. But wherever we go, wherever we travel, wherever we speak, wherever we interact, we find that the law, the legal issues, the changes happening in the law, the fighting for justice in the courts, the struggle for justice beyond borders, if you like, is universal.
Right.
There's no difference really when you look at the cases going on in the European Court of Human Rights, or even in the constitutional courts of Latin America. If you look at the African judgments coming out, if you look at Asia and tiny little Nepal, which declared unconstitutional marital rape while India still keeps it on the statute. If you look at Pakistan, where the army had played such a prominent role and where women are treated so badly sometimes, often, you find that the battle against the old way of understanding the law, the old way of using the law, the old way of arguing, which is prevalent actually in many jurisdictions in Europe, is rapidly disappearing. And there are people, men, women, indigenous people, all kinds of people using the courts for emancipation and freedom. Is it a local struggle? Not at all. Is the use of judgments from the developed world prevalent in the developing countries? Very often. Is the reverse happening? Not so true. You won't find the American Supreme Court or European courts taking judgments, beautiful judgments, from India or Pakistan or Nepal or Thailand and so on. But the fight in the courts, just to give you one example, the fight in the courts is a universal globalized fight, which recognizes no boundaries. And despite the resistance of judges in Europe, in the so-called developed world, to the kind of public interest litigation growing in developing countries, where we don't follow the European norms, that you can't have a class action, you can't bring 1 million people together in one case, and so on. And this artificial division, between economic rights or, not justiciable, and you can't go to court and say, I need the right to food, I need the right to housing, I need the right to healthcare. Courts are not supposed to give you that in the developed countries. But in the developing world, where the government begins to crack and shrivel up or crumble and is unable to give constitutionally protected rights, the courts step in. And the courts do a wonderful action, which the jurists in the developed world frown upon. And they say if the government can't deliver economic rights, we will, through the judgments of the court. So that's going to globalize. I'm sure that this kind of movement is going to globalize. And ultimately, the fuddy-duddies in the developed world occupying positions of high powers in the Supreme Court and High Court will be forced to recognize that their system is obsolete and outdated like themselves.
Well, so let me ask you this, since you've talked about, well, you're a lawyer, but since you have actually brought these landmark judgments, in the Indian context, as you know, there is a huge gap between law on paper, de jure, and law on ground, in fact. And a lot of critics are talking about, let's say, the previous regime before now, that was a regime of rights. Everyone had a right to everything, all of these different rights that were passed as judgments in the court, but these rights don't actually happen on ground. Why do you think using the law to sort of enshrine a right in the Constitution, make that the first step? Why do you think that's significant when access to law or rights in practice are actually the problem? Why do you think it's an important first step to have that?
See, you're right when you say that, when you talk about the law and how judgments are delivered, there's a huge gap between the letter of the law and its actual working out on the ground. That is true. But there's another side to this, which is judgments of courts very often translate into benefits for the poor. But that happens only when people mobilize. Mobilize and take a judgment of the court and go out on the streets against their governments and against their police and against their politicians and force the enforcement of rights. You are right in the sense that if people don't agitate for their rights and rely on the courts and say, oh, well, a nice judgment has come, that it is not going to be translated into practice. But when people who have a vested right in a judgment agitate and fight for the implementation of that judgment, you see things happening on the ground which you could not imagine. Therefore, though it is true that there is a yawning gap between the law and the implementation of the law, that gap is often, in important cases, being bridged by people's mobilization, making it very difficult for the governments to not implement the law.
Right.
And for judges subsequently in contempt of court actions, for not implementing the judgment of the court, it becomes very difficult for those judges not to take up the matter in contempt jurisdiction,
right,
and catch the highest officer in the department and threaten to put him in jail. So contempt of court jurisdiction is the way in which judgments of the courts are enforced.
And I think that's very important because even in my experience working with slums, for example, when people come to know that they have certain rights, it's a very empowering, I think, moment as well, because it gives them something to then go out it gives them a certain sense of justice and power when they go out on the streets, when they mobilize, because they know that institutionally some rights are enshrined. So I think that's very important. But thank you for actually clarifying. Um, there's
Or can I say, actually the
yeah.
housing example is an example where brilliant judgments of our courts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is almost, I could say, across the developing world, it's or the global south, it's almost universally true. This is a good example of the law remaining on paper only.
Housing, you mean?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And in India, particularly, we've got such brilliant judgments. And that's the point you made earlier, brilliant judgments. But the courts don't want to enforce. And the most cruel demolitions have taken place, where
Yeah.
you can throw the judgments of the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court and say
Yeah.
they must be rehabilitated, and the Supreme Court will say, oh, well, okay, we've heard that argument before. And as we speak in Delhi, 10,000 hutments,
Yeah.
or roughly about 90,000 people,
Yeah.
are going to be demolished day after tomorrow
Yeah.
during the period of COVID. And you
Yeah.
can imagine 90,000 people with their women and children in the slums, in the mud,
Yeah.
and amidst the rubble. Can you imagine what's going to happen then?
Yeah.
Happen to them during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that was going to be my next question, and it actually dovetails with a lot of um, sort of political and human rights crisis that are stemming from this lockdown and the sort of COVID crisis that has happened, which is that in many countries, well, in one case, there are authoritarian regimes that are able to do a number of things under the radar. So that's one problem that people are trying to talk about. But in India, for sure, those on the margins, I mean, this is a very dangerous time where those on the margins, I mean, we already know that people have, because of this year and a half sort of long lockdown now, we don't have any official estimates of poverty, but we can definitely say that the levels of poverty now, people slipping below the poverty line, is going to be dangerously high. You mentioned, I mean, it is unimaginable to think that courts and governments could actually kick people out of their homes at a time when it's a global sort of crisis of life. But we are seeing this in India right now. I mean, not only is there not conversation around compensation for, let's say, the millions of urban informal workers who have been without a job for a year now, but there is actually almost punishment and further marginalization of the poor during this time. And so there are many approaches to this that are possible to work on. Of course, there is more pushing on, let's say, something like social protection policies or economic measures to come. That's one area to focus on. And another, which I was thinking, because I'm a political scientist, so I feel like the focus on making sure people have a voice or of participation, formal participation in democracy beyond elections, that's something which we don't have. So we have to constantly focus on policy measures and implementing them. But I feel like there isn't really a way for those who are being evicted, or the migrants that were forced to leave the cities, for them to have a say, a formal say in any of these decisions, right? How do we, I mean, what are the different ways in which we can approach these crises that are coming out of a public health crisis, which itself we cannot handle, seemingly?
See, I've taken a different tack today, and it's a sort of tack that I've come to solidly take,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the recent years. And I never suggest to anyone that the legal system is a solution. It's just a weapon, not very effective weapon, but a weapon that can be used at times. And I don't like to suggest anymore that, there are these solutions to the, for crisis management. I don't use that language anymore. And there are these kind of things that could be done and those kind of things that could be done, because I've come to believe fundamentally that short of revolution, organizing, mobilizing, changing the system completely, there is really no hope for change in this world. And we should never tell young people. I mean, I would not say, tell us, what is your solution to the problem? Give me 101 solutions. Because there aren't any. There are the illusions of solution. There are the illusions of change. But the only thing which is not an illusion is the working people and the middle classes who identify with them coming together and fighting on the streets, fighting wherever, in parliament, in courts, wherever. But a terrible, terrible struggle. And I say terrible because the consequences are terrible. In India, we have our lawyers in jail, some of our finest lawyers in jail. In India, we've had a journalist shot. So I have changed and I begin to feel that short of mass mobilization and political mobilization, one should never say that this terrible crisis in which we are in, and capitalism is in, and globalization is in, this can be solved by tinkering with the system, or by doing this, or by doing that. We may say anything, like I be a lawyer, I continue being a lawyer, right? I recognize I sometimes am able to do good work, but I always say that the role of the lawyer, apart from fighting in courts, is to be in the middle of struggle. Be in the middle of struggle. Be among the people. Learn from them. And always be with people. And always see the world through the eyes of the working class and the poor. And never give up struggle. Struggle everywhere. Struggle even if you are alone. Don't look over your shoulder to see if the world is coming behind you in support of what you're doing. Have confidence, have certainty that the spiritual energy of the people will prevail. The non-violent spiritual energy of people against tanks, against guns, against dictatorships, against armies, against the police will prevail. Humankind and its spiritual, the absolute inside you, which Hinduism teaches us. Actually, all religion teaches us that. The spiritual, the absolute inside you is more powerful than anything else. That is what we must teach our young, to break from tradition. Not listen to their parents when they tell them to hold back. Not listen to the older generation and, these people of rank, as Indians are very prone to, be very, subservient to people of rank. Break all, be iconoclastic. Break all that thinking. Trust in your instinct of the young and the radical, and do things that people have not done in a long, long time.
I mean, we don't have any questions from the audience I see right now. Technically, we should allow questions from the audience. I'll keep an eye out. And as questions come, I'll integrate them into our conversation. So,
Sorry, there are 4 questions right now. Are you able to see them? Can you click on the Q&A box?
Yeah, but expanded. It was unexpanded. All right. Okay, great. Thank you for letting me know. All right. So our first question is actually from Hong Kong. And so the question is, coming from Hong Kong and seeing how authorities bend law and create new laws to suppress the fights for human rights and freedom, what practical tips would you have for somebody who wants to create change under such type of authority or authoritarian response? Practical tips.
Well, since the speaker is coming from Hong Kong, I would say because I believe the Hong Kong activists and the things that they did, which was shown right across the world, are in the front line of the struggle for a new world, of non-violent direct action. And they've shown how people can mobilize against a very repressive regime and a repressive police force. And like the Arab Spring and the fights that took place there, and people fought against the armies and so on of the Arab countries, non-violently again. I think the only tip that I can possibly give is learn from these lessons. Learn from the Arab Spring and the crushing of the Arab Spring. Learn from the Hong Kong activists. Learn from activists throughout the world who are fighting against injustice, very often losing and bouncing back to fight again. Agitate, organize, educate, and struggle till the end. Always nonviolent.
I'm going to put two questions or comments together. One is from Colombia, and I think the other is from India. And I put them together, though they're not exactly worded similarly, because I think the argument is that sort of economically, that the sort of economic shape or extent of poverty is qualitatively different in the global south. So for example, in a place like Colombia, where you have conflict as well as poverty, both to serious extent. And the other is the comment from a comment from India, which talks about this kind of taking the north-south divide further, actually, and sort of touching upon using concepts such as decolonization to come up with sort of, this question says, one of the ignored crises in India is the interpretation of our culture. I'm going to say political culture as well, from the crutches of colonized perspectives. And it asks about decolonizing the thought structure so that we perceive activism and political ideologies differently. And I put it together with a question from Colombia to say, well, qualitatively, the economic structures, the incentives, the things that the poor are struggling with day to day, and activists themselves also struggle with day to day, is very severe. So how do we sort of come up with a new paradigm that takes our sort of richness in our sort of our culture in different countries of the global south, our approach to society and culture and politics, and sort of use that rather than sort of coming at it from maybe colonial understanding of economy, poverty, and so on. So how do we use what we have, the resources we have?
Yeah, I don't really think I know the answer to this question. I don't think I even understand it fully. I don't think the differences between the global south and the global north in terms of poverty is very different. Whatever difference there was is rapidly eroding. And you look at America and see homelessness there. You look at America and see hunger there. You look at America and see the use of violence against ordinary people, particularly particular minority communities. I feel that the gap on these indices of poverty and discrimination and so on, this gap is rapidly decreasing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it is of much significance. I don't feel it is of much significance to emphasize that the poor in the north and the poor in the south are different. You need very different strategies. I've traveled a little bit of the world and I've seen struggles in the developed countries. I've seen struggles in the developing countries. And yes, it is different. But I would be inclined to take a very broad and I think a very sweeping view and say that actually strategies are very similar. Conditions are very similar. violence against women and discrimination against women is common right across the world. Discrimination and violence against indigenous people is common right across the world. You could take America, you could take Australia, you could take anywhere. It's right across. Discrimination and violence against women is common. I think there is a great commonality, which is not emphasized too much. And I would sort of not be very happy with kind of approach which gives you very fine distinctions between countries on the basis of their geographical situation. I think the working class is becoming one large mass of destitute humanity wherever they may live, of suffering humanity wherever they may live.
But do you think if we focus on thought leadership from countries that have historically sort of been marginalized on the geopolitical stage, it could be countries in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, wherever. Do you think that a new paradigm for activism and politics can emerge from some of the cultures in these areas? So, for example, approach to the environment based on how the indigenous communities, for example, have a relationship with environment and sort of environmental governance, so to speak. Do you think new paradigms and ideologies can emerge from the sort of post-colonial countries in the global south?
Again, I'm not sure I know the question. And again, I'm not sure that I understand the question fully. But if you look at indigenous people and protection of the environment and climate change and so on, these values have existed for a very, very long time in communities. The solutions have existed for a very long time. The resistance against domination, which destroys the environment and so on, has also carried on for a very long time. I'm not sure whether decolonization gives our struggles a different hue, or rather it might give it a different hue. But I feel the areas of continuity and change, the areas of convergence and commonality is much higher. That the struggles of the people on, let's take the example you took on the environment and climate, of the indigenous people and those associated with those struggles, has been there for a very, very long time. And the bitterness and the experiences and the sufferings and the losses of those movements have been there for a very long time. It's like one continuum of domination, one continuum of suffering, and one continuum of struggle for emancipation and freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made this point earlier, is that I think that we are constantly trying to look for a solution and a panacea and how we can sort of bring it into this existing paradigm, economic global paradigm. But I think, as you pointed out, we need the need of the hour is to actually mobilize around that solution, to actually break the paradigm, as it were, rather than sort of stay within it and keep looking for this next solution that's going to solve the sort of challenge, as it were, right?
I was struggling to find an answer, but I think I have a feeling you gave the answer much more easily and
trying to word things carefully so we don't start, any fires here right away. We actually have a comment from someone that has interned with HRLN. Devika Vora, she says that interning with you was a life-changing experience. But the question is more about, sort of organizational. So, do you have a base in Geneva? Can students in Geneva actually assist HRLN? Also, what are your views on human rights lawyers and activists being underpaid? Will the situation ever change? And actually, this is a very important question, right? I mean, we have been talking in ideological terms, and then there's always the bread and butter issues. How is a young person supposed to plan their path forward, their career, work with networks such as yours, when there's such a huge push to, it's more than a livelihood push, right? It's this huge financial push. How does one think about this or structure their career choices, I guess?
Well, let's look at the first question. No, we don't have a base in Geneva or anywhere else in the developed world because we never looked that way. There are other groups that go to the UN and so on, but I have found intervening in the UN generally very wasteful of our time. And I found that the benefits of that as compared to using a constitutional law system to get orders and so on, I mean, incomparably better to do this. Go to the local courts and go to your high courts and Supreme Court. Although I do admit it is very important sometimes to work within the Western system in Geneva and the UN system and so on. But it's a terribly wasteful system where the poor really have no voice. And it's only an illusion of participation of the poor in world human rights governance and so on. So I have my own, as you can make out already, a very jaundiced view of this whole, system and whether it yields any results at all. But as far as salaries of lawyers and so on, I want to say this much. And people tell me sometimes, that, oh, Mr. Gonsalves, if you had taken up commercial law instead of human rights law, you would have been earning so much money. And you're an IIT engineer if you had taken up engineering. And I think to myself, that's a load of rubbish because I don't think I would be doing anything useful anywhere except in human rights. And about the standard of living and so on, let me tell you, frankly, it doesn't matter. Your salaries will be much lower. If you're a lawyer, the salaries will be much, much lower. You would never be able to afford the kind of houses and cars and other luxuries that lawyers have. But nothing can replace the spiritual peace that you have and the great joy that you get every day after a grueling day in court. The great joy that you get when you've used the law to better the lives of millions of people. And I use the word millions with great care because I think a human rights lawyer, say at the end of 30 years of practice, when the time comes for retiring or for dying, you can look back and say you brought joy, not just to 1 or 10 or 100 people. You brought joy and relief and a smile on their faces and peace in their hearts to thousands and tens of thousands of people. One demolition you stop, and 100,000 people are saved. That kind of thing. And I don't like it when people think, well, I think, I'll do human rights work after doing commercial work for some time. And I know human rights work is a different world. It's a different world. Money counts, no doubt. But it's a different world and great joyousness and great happiness, despite not having enough, sometimes to make ends meet. It's a great joy and it's irreplaceable.
Yeah.
It's so joyous, the struggle for human rights. And nothing can replace it. And people come, I must say, people come to the Human Rights Law Network. We look for a certain quality of person, right? The drifter, the vagrant, the discontented, the angry, the unhappy, the frustrated, looking for a new world and a new life, and we give them that. So we take all those who are discards in society, in a sense, and we turn them into marvelous warriors on behalf of the poor. And they do magic. Once they find their way in life, once the winds of change catch their sails and move them quickly forward, they do magic. These drifters and, no-gooders, so to speak, they do magic in the world.
Yeah. But I mean, I still think of solutions. And I'll come back to Devika's question a little bit, because I have seen this on ground in my research, is this the question of access to law. And I think that's a very, so access to law as in access to courts, but also access to law as in knowledge about the law and about legal entitlements. And I think that's a very important part of the sort of chain that you have described when using law as a mechanism specifically for human rights, right? So maybe students, even while they are students or even while they're students of law, that can be a role to play, right? To actually work to sort of disseminate knowledge to particularly, to the poor about their entitlements, the rule of law, what kinds of things they should be, they can do much before they can actually be equipped to actually fight a court case, right? So these are some of the other things that can be done.
Look, we have interns in the Human Rights Law Network who are first-year law students.
Mm-hmm.
We have some who are not yet out of school.
Mm-hmm.
They are practicing. They're drafting petitions. They're preparing petitions for the Supreme Court and the High Court.
Mm-hmm.
And once you understand that human rights law is really very simple, right? And all it needs is to capture the anguish of the poor and the injustice done to them by the police and the state and politicians and so on. Young people can play a very big role in
Mm-hmm.
human rights law.
Mm-hmm.
I began practicing law even before I became a lawyer. I was a trade union activist.
Mm-hmm.
And as an activist, I had the license to go to court, put on a black tie and pretend I'm a lawyer and practice in courts. Yeah, it's true. So lawyers have a huge, young people, and younger are better because their imagination is running wild. They don't have the limitations of age. Young people can play a huge role. And the number of cases, there are millions of human rights cases to be done. Slum dwellers, women, Dalits, tribals, environmental cases, consumer rights cases. You can get more work in terms of law and practice in the human rights movement, broadly speaking, than you can get in commercial litigation. Huge potential, not tapped, not explored. Why? Because the young under globalization, unlike the young in the earlier period of social democracy, earlier we thought when we were in students that we can change the world. One person can change the world, like Che Guevara. But globalization atomized the individual. I can't do anything by myself unless I have people to support me. Right? It atomized them. It made them fearful. It made them lose confidence in the ability of an individual without any help to change the world around them. That's what it did. And human rights law must bring that back. Human rights must bring it back. That confidence in a young person to change the world, no matter what the odds are. And history is full of millions of great and glorious human rights warriors fought single-handedly and vanquished a much more powerful and superior foe. That confidence must come back. With the destruction of this globalization kind of attitude and values and kind of stuff, and you get back to socialistic principles that we live to change the world. If we have one thing why we live, it is to change the world around us. And if necessary, die in that attempt to change the world. Once that confidence comes back, the working people are unbreakable. The young will be unbreakable. Today, they're all mamas and papas boys who, their mamas and papas will tell them where to go, which college to go to, what to do, what is safe to do, what is safe not to do, what is dangerous to do. This kind of stuff. And I see it in our young students. I see it. Not in the Dalit students, not in the tribal students, not in the poorest, but you see it in the colleges, which should be grounds, areas of ferment and uprising. In today's circumstances, where there's so much suffering, The universities should be areas of great ferment. And what do you have? Quiescence, passiveness, lack of confidence. Follow the leader. Once that breaks, India will be totally free, real freedom from all this kind of oppression.
Well, I suppose for but I mean, I think I can. There is a very specific lesson here. Well, I take this lesson for participants, for example, of something like a Geneva challenge, right? That are trying to come up with their original ideas to problems and so on. Is it's kind of not enough to come up with this solution. You kind of have to go out and put it into action and fight for it, right? That's what we are talking about. We're really talking about putting things into action, because there is only so much we can do with sort of putting solutions on paper. No, but that is something, I mean, like even with law, as you've said, the framework's there, a lot of laws are there, but at the end of the day, you still need to fight to get that right delivered to somebody that needs it, right? So I kind of packaged the revolutionary message.
See, I said that deliberately, you know why? Because certain language people have become ashamed of using certain words in certain language.
That's
because
correct.
they've been stigmatized by the right. Oh, a revolutionary, he must be a crank. Always talking about revolution, he must be one of those. What do you mean, one of those? People who gave their lives for the poor and working class people,
Absolutely.
for the indigenous people, for the Dalits, for the poor, you know? And we must no longer be ashamed. We must be proud of our heritage of struggle and revolution and changing society through means that are lawful and sometimes not so lawful. A changed society, force the change. That's why I use the words now, because we must reclaim that honor in struggle, honor in social change, honor in revolution. I think I took you a little bit off track, huh?
No, I am very excited. I am more excited than you know by this discussion. And I mean, I really miss having this discussion perhaps in person where we could interact with students face to face. I'm sure they miss it too. I mean, it's a very different experience to have something like this entirely online. And it's kind of our loss that we are not all in the same place talking about this. I'm sure the interaction would have been far more vibrant with more questions. I mean, there are a couple of questions here. I think you addressed them, so I'll sort of address them in the chat box separately. But Mukhtar, are there any other points or structural things to address? Do we wrap up with some concluding words? Can you give me a sign?
We can wrap up, Sylvie. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Colin. I mean, this has actually been very inspiring for me too, and I would like to sort of take the opportunity to end the session by thanking you so much for your time. I mean, and for thanking the audience, the students, for really, I mean, it's been very hard on so many people, not, you know, emotionally as well as, you know, the emotional cost of the pandemic and the lockdown has been very high for most, if not all of us. So thank you everybody for participating, and I really hope that at the very least things open up in a way that we can get around in person together sometime soon and address these issues. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your words. Really, really appreciated. And everybody take care and good luck. Right. Thank you. Thank you.